because I frankly did not feel like looking like a person. We're gonna kind of walk through and work through how to take a pattern off of an existing garment. I'm going to do it with our Kiva Corselet here because I want to make a pattern for our Patreon, and it's also a nice sort of reasonably sized garment to work with. So if you're going to take a pattern from an original garment, there are a few ways to go about it, and it depends on the garment. If it's a garment that's not precious, like, you know, your favorite pair of jeans that's worn out and you want to make a copy or a t-shirt or whatever, you can just push pin it down to your paper, especially if you have a pinnable tabletop like mine. By the way, I apologize for the state of this table. It's a hot mess. I need to recover it, but my paper for that is down south at the other studio. We're at the turret today. The logistics of my life are complicated, to say the least. So we have a hot mess table, hot mess hands. I'm not on the screen. We got this. So if you want to take a pattern from a simple garment that you don't care about, you can actually push pin it or pin it to your paper and then trace that. If you have a pinnable tabletop like this, you can use a pounce wheel too, also to trace through. I'm not going to do it that way with this garment because although it is, quite frankly, a hot mess, I don't really want to do more damage to it. We are going to do a hybrid of measuring and kind of redrafting and also pinning fabric to it and then using that to take a pattern from the garment and transferring that to paper. Kind of like a reverse mock-up sort of thing. So the first thing I'm going to do, though, is compare both sides of this garment to make sure that it is, in fact, symmetrical, and it absolutely is. For all intents and purposes, it's the same right and left, which is kind of nice because we only have to worry about one side, other than some of the belts and crisscrossy bits. But the main pattern pieces are symmetrical right and left. And if you want to learn more about this garment, you can watch our earlier video about the Kiva Corselet and sport corsets. The first thing you want to do is get familiar with the garment you are going to be copying a pattern from. By that I mean look at how many seams there are, where they are, and what the shapes look like. It might be more straightforward than you think. For instance, now that I start looking at this, I can see that from center back all the way to here, that is all one piece all the way across the front of the garment. This is the second piece. So there is only one interior vertical seam on this entire corset. Looking at the outside, you wouldn't necessarily guess that. You might think that some might be hiding under the exterior bone channels. So that actually makes our job really easy. Usually I would be doing this on just patterning paper, but like I said, that's all down at the other studio. So I'm going to use computer paper, and that will actually make it easier for you to see what I'm doing. So I guess that's kind of a boon in some ways. I actually need to tape two pieces together really quick so I have enough. So you want to pay attention to the pattern piece shapes, where the seams are, and you also want to pay attention to where the grain is. That is a really important part. You might look at this garment and assume that the straight of grain is like at the center back, but it's actually not. So you can see it kind of comes at an angle here to the center back. So the straight of grain actually runs a bit on the diagonal. So that's something you're going to want to record as well. I'm going to do this piece kind of in sections here. And I'm going to hold it flat rather than pinning it. So I'm just tracing the edge, being careful not to actually draw on the thing. Tracing slightly outside. I will go in and clean up those lines later, but I'm just getting the kind of general overall shape. I'm going to go ahead and mark that slit there for the belt while I'm at it. Down here at the bottom, I'm going to just fold up the edge. Put some tick marks where those little skirty bits, which we still haven't definitively discovered the use for, by the way. Okay, now over here, hold that flat. So this is going to be a Patreon only pattern, but I am showing you how very simple this garment is. So drafting your own from honestly a body block, even a modern body block, would be pretty simple. All right, so this curve front seam here is a little tricky. Without pinning through it or anything, I'm going to continue to hold it in place, fold back that edge, and mark approximately where that edge falls. Again, I am going to clean up all of these lines later and true everything up. I am just getting the rough shape. There is the rough start of our pattern, and that's a really nice little bust curve right there. That looks good. That looks plausible. It's always nice to see shapes that look like actual pattern shapes once you take the garment off. That means you're on the right track usually. Now I'm just going to sort of clean up all of these lines here. I also don't have any curves here. They're all down at the studio because I've been working on a theatrical project down there. So all of my drafting tools are basically down there. All I have up here is stuff for cutting. So this is kind of not the most like profesh, but you guys get the idea. Now, if this was a garment that I didn't care about, I would have just pounce wheeled right through. And if I had a pounce wheel here, I don't think I actually do, now that I think about it. I would have pounced right through on the grain line so that I would have that marked already, but I didn't do that. So I'm going to go ahead and mark the grain. You know what, on this one, the horizontal is much more apparent. So I'm gonna mark the horizontal and then I can use that to mark the vertical for my grain. So I'm just gonna lay that over on top of the horizontal weave. I'm gonna pull the garment out from under it. That's my horizontal. So that means that this is my straight of grain right here. Boom. Okay, so that's our first piece. Now we're gonna do this front piece. And I'll go ahead and just show you the other way of taking a pattern off with fabric, just so I've demonstrated that technique as well. I am going to straight pin through this. Please nobody report me to the Historical Clothing Preservation Society, whatever. These are very fine pins. I'm not worried about it. I wouldn't do this to like 18th century stays, but it's fine. Fine for this. So I've pinned that over top here. So now, this is hard to see, but basically what I'm doing is spreading out the garment so that it's nice and flat. I'm not pulling any of this, and I'm just walking the fabric over. And then I'm going to pin down that seam. You want to get all of your big pieces done, and then you can kind of go back and add details. And you guys, I'm not going for a super produced video on this one. I realized that's been holding me back on making videos because I've started to feel like they have to be perfect and like well produced and gorgeous, and it turns out that it's hard to find the time to do that when you're also like running a business and a half. This is a bit of a mess. I'm a bit of a mess here in early 2021, so it all works. So choose the technique to take the pattern based on the age of your garment, the preciousness of your garment, the shape. This technique I'm showing here works really well for three-dimensional sleeves and things where you can't lay something out flat. So you would cover the whole thing in fabric, then remove that. So you're taking kind of a ghost copy off the top of the garment. That's roughly our piece. And I matched the edge there to make my life easier. So then you take this off. I noticed that the grain on the front is also not parallel. with the center front. If it was, that would be easy because the center front would be my grain line then. I think that this curve and this curve were probably patterned to be the same on that garment. It would make sense from a shaping standpoint and also from a manufacturing perspective. If those curves match, it's a much easier seam to stitch, but they don't always. You don't always have to have matching curves on corsets or garments. So once I get this traced out on paper, I'll compare again and see if that's likely the case or if it's off enough that I think that they actually did change it on purpose. Okay, at this point, I'm going to push pin in. Now I don't have a pounce wheel here, so instead I'm going to just push pin through real quick to mark. Yeah, so if I compare this edge to that edge, I really do think it's a symmetrical seam just looking at the way the grain line and the way the fabric's behaving. It's actually exactly the same from the waist up to about this point here. That's where it goes a little wonky. It's a little tough to take a pattern off this very top part because on the outside there's an applied corded strip, and that strip is straight, and so it's been applied on top of the curve. So that's part of why all this wrinkling is happening here. It's kind of seized it up. So I have to do a little bit of guesswork as far as what the shape actually is up here. But for simplicity's sake and garment making sense sake, I'm going to say that it is even. So I'm going to do a bit of a split the difference here. This, I'm going to add a little bit more to it at that bust curve. I'm going to say that this comes to about the middle of the distance between this line and what I pounced. So actually it's more like here. And then I'm going to actually kick this out a little bit on this side. And I think that'll get us closer to the shape I'm actually seeing in the garment and just can't quite get off of the fabric. So now, so that we're actually working on this same side for both of these pieces, I will go ahead and just mark that on this side too, so it's easier to see. So this is our basic pattern. I still need to get the grain line for this one. So here's an interesting thing I'm noticing actually, now that I look closely at this. The front is cut, the front is cut on the cross. So you can see that heavy texture of the weave here, that's across the grain. The straight of grain would be here. This is a denim weave, really tightly woven twill. So those are the weft threads. But over here, it's very clearly this way. Now, the question is that a strength reason? Is that structural choice? Or is that because it fit on the fabric the most economically that way for manufacture? Compared to the straight of grain on the back, the straight of grain, this is my cross grain. So the straight of grain on this piece is actually here. And notice it's not directly on center either. Historical corsets employ bias so much more frequently than we expect. It's one of my favorite things about them. I'm not going to put any seam allowance in this pattern, not for Patreon either, because I think it's easiest to add your own seam allowance, and if I'm going to do a pattern without instructions, I find it easiest to have the finished edge and the seam edges be what the edges are, and then you can add what you want after that. So I'm just going to do really quick tick marks. Then I'll go in and I'll measure their widths so that I get that really nice and accurate. I'm actually using the other side of the garment now, and it does all kind of match up still too, which is good. Sometimes you'll end up with a garment that's been super distorted by wear, so that's part of looking at the grain, because you want to make sure that it hasn't been torqued so out of proportion from the original pattern that your shapes are just implausible and ridiculous. That's one thing to keep in mind when you're using patterns taken off of extant garments. You can only get so accurate to the original. It will never be exactly the same as the pattern that was used to make the original garment. There's shrinkage, there's wear, there's all sorts of things going on in an extant garment that are going to mean that you need to take your pattern with a grain of salt. So that measures, that center back, that's a 7/8 inch wide finished. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that. Now, while I'm back here, I am noticing something here on this back corner that I'm going to adjust, because this, in my tracing, this came out a little obtuse, but in looking at this, I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be a logical right angle. So how did that happen? Well, actually, no, it's not. It's just stretched to look like a right angle, but if I look at the grain, it really actually does look like it's a slightly obtuse angle. I think it's slightly less obtuse than this. So what I'm going to do is just kind of true this corner ever so slightly. Not to a perfectly right angle, because if they did it that way, they probably did it for a reason. Sometimes. Sometimes it's just stitcher error or whatever. People made mistakes then, people make mistakes now. That's 7/8, that's 7/8. These are all 7/8 inch wide. The center back has 2 steel bones in it. The rest of these are some sort of natural substance. I'm not sure if they're baleen or what. I talk more about that in our other video about this specific garment. Haha, I did miss something. Look at that. So always double check. I missed my tick mark over here. So this one actually goes this way. And I'm going to leave this in this video. Because guess what? I make mistakes all the darn time. So this one corresponds to this one, which means we have this one, and then we have one more triple bone casing, which starts 1/4 inch away from this one and goes. Then we have one single bone casing before the seam, one straddles the seam, and one's on the front. And those single ones measure like just under 1/2 inch. That, folks, is the back piece, more or less, of a Kiva Corselet sport corset. Now I'm going to check the length from top edge to the width of that corded portion. It's 2 inches right at this center front seam, so I'm going to go ahead and mark that tick mark, and then I'm going to note that it ends abruptly underneath, kind of in the middle of that first triple one right here. So I can figure out the angle on the application of this piece by measuring from the top edge down on that triple piece. That is 1.25 inches. Inch and a quarter. So it ends about there. While I'm at it, I'll get the measurements. That's 5/16. How fancy. Here. Just under 7/8. Everyone who works in metric is probably going, oh my god, this would be so much easier in metric. Yep, it would. The binding is an even 1/2 inch, so that's nice and simple. This is really chunky binding compared to finer corsetry of the period. It's like hefty, and it actually is double-sided. It's sandwiched on either side of the corset, which is something I have not seen before in regular corsetry. You can actually see that. So there's an inner strip and an outer strip. However, they are cut on the straight of grain. Okay, I'm going to mark this point here because that is the same on both sides. It's just one side has a belt loop at this point and the other side has a slit for the crisscross strap situation. So that, measured up from the bottom, is 2.5 inches. That's easy. And then that is just under 1 inch wide. So that is our attachment point there for the buckle belts. The bottom edge is also treated the same way. Looks like they stitched on the flippy flappies. I'm going to keep calling them that. I know that's ridiculous, but it makes me laugh. It feels like they butted the flippy flappies onto the bottom, so they like laid them on top, basted, and then applied the binding on inner and inside and outside. Okay, first I'm going to measure this front busk section. Just scant of 7/8. I think that the 4mm synthetic whalebone would work really well for these, and the 6 would work in these casings. So that's convenient, actually, that we have modern equivalents that are similar. There's a tiny little bone right here, too, that goes all the way down. It's really soft. I can't tell if it's... I can't tell what it is. What's really fascinating is that the busk really does stop right there. It's like bra height. And then this is soft down here. There is some ad copy talking about how these are good for early pregnancy because the front area is very adjustable. So that's where our front belt attaches. I'm noticing there's more distance here on the garment than what I've ended up with on my draft. So what I'm going to do is double check from the height, from the top of the cording to here is 1.25 inches, or 1 1/8 inches, I misspoke. And I've ended up with it at 1.25 inches. That's the issue of like adding lines on top of each other, that with your pencil marks and human error and slight adjustments in the measuring tools, you can end up with things growing or shrinking a little bit. So it's always nice to go back and measure from like the bottom to the top to make sure everything in between adds up to the right thing. The last thing you want to do is what's called truing your pattern. That means you check seams to make sure they're the same length if they're supposed to be, or they're not if they're not supposed to be. If there's some ease in your seam or something. And you also check seam edges to make sure that nothing does any sort of weird flaring or like peaking. So down here, I'm going to compare and make sure that this is a nice, logical, even line all the way across. That looks really good. So I like that down there. So now I'm going to match those lines at the bottom. This to here. Okay. So I'm going to match that top edge. You see how it's a little off kilter? It's like 1/8 of an inch off, but those are the things you want to check for when you're making your own pattern or taking it off of a garment. I'm going to just go ahead and say that we can true this straight across, make that a logical, even, straight piece. This goes like that. And you can see why we've got bunching going on in the bust of the garment, because if we're putting a straight applied corded piece over something with this much curve in it, yeah, it's going to get a little funky under there. So this seam, when it's stitched in the actual garment, it's stitched with the seam allowance to the outside, and then the bone casing is applied over top. So that's why it's so nice and clean on the inside. Okay, we've trued our seams, we have our grain lines marked, we have all of our edges figured out, and so now it's just up to all the little other bits, belts and tabs and flippy flappies. Thank you guys for watching this. I hope this was helpful and interesting, and look for this pattern on our Patreon very soon.